International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in The Hague, and her supervisor was Dick Robeson. Her PhD dissertation was on the politics of entrapment, the World Bank, the integrated development model, and citizenship at a crossroad. Currently, she's the associate professor in the College of International Relations at Ritsuitan University, thank you, Kyoto, and her research interests include politics of international aid, global governance and the World Bank, gender violence and international criminal court and Africa. She is currently working on the international political economy of regulatory mining regimes in Southeast Asia, with a particular interest on the role of the World Bank group in fostering a new wave, a wave of new governance frameworks. And Pascale's published on this in, for example, the Journal of Contemporary Asia. So the seminar today will be on her new forthcoming book called Regimes at Risk, the World Bank and the Transformation of Mining in Asia. So we welcome you very much. Could you speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Jane. Thank you very much for coming. I hear that it's vacation time at this university, so I really appreciate your time. I see Damian Stellan over there, and Richard Robinson, who's supposed to be in the room. I was saying Diane was my academic advisor at Warwick University, and then Dick is going to come, and he was my supervisor, so I feel like a student again to represent. Yes, so today I would like to talk a little bit about my forthcoming book. I'm in the last phase of doing the last edit. It's Regimes of Risk, the World Bank, and the Transformation of Mining in Asia. Basically, in the past I've worked on mining activities in Africa, mostly West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, and I know that over there the World Bank was quite present. And when I moved to Asia, I'm now based in Japan, I wanted to continue that type of research, but apparently there's no funding for Africa in Japan. So that was quite interesting. So I kind of recycled myself and tried to see what was happening in Asia. So I'm by no means an Asian expert, but somehow for the last 3 years I came to be fascinated by some of the countries. I've been looking at 3 case studies, the Philippines, Laos, and Mongolia. 3 countries where the World Bank Group has had quite an impressive presence, and I wrote a couple of articles, and I participated to many seminars that were organized notably by Toby Carroll in Singapore, and Dick Shahar was there at some point, and it ended up, I had many suggestions to just compile everything and to try to write a book about it, and so I did. So today I'll talk to you a little bit about the book. Can you figure this out? There you go. So I'll talk to you a little bit about my research and the framework that I've been using. I think that it would be a little bit more illustrative and entertaining if I also gave you one of the case studies. So I'll talk to you about Mongolia. Mongolia, there are so many things happening at this very moment when we're talking about mining, so it makes it an ongoing case study. It's almost impossible to write the final sentence because every day something happens that completely challenges everything, and then a few conclusions. So if I'm presenting the book overall, it would be building on case studies located in Laos, Mongolia, and the Philippines. The book follows the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group's attempts to promote a particular politics of mining in resource-rich country clients, and the analysis focuses on how such mining governance is being transplanted, hijacked, and contested in national and local arenas. So it's very much a book about the World Bank. It's about how the World Bank is trying to conceptualize mining for its country clients, how it's conceptualizing it, how it's promoting it with governments, and in turn how it all basically unravels on the ground. So with different stages that I think are quite interesting. So I have three main objectives, as I just basically told you. First of all, I wanted to look at the bank. And by the bank, I really wanted to look at the World Bank Group, because I think that it's quite important to look at the group as a whole, because it has quite a weight and complementary roles. And here I'm talking about ABRD, IDA, MIGA, IFC, whereby one works with the private sector and the other one works with governments. And at the end, you really kind of have almost saturated the arena for the promotion of a very particular type of mining governance in resource-rich countries. I basically labeled the new types of mining regimes that the World Bank is promoting as the SDM, the social development model, which is basically a new form of mining governance where the bank is saying it's actually possible to do mining in a form that will be very respectful of the environment, of the local group, the local communities. There are some catchphrases here, a lot of partnerships, participation, empowerment. I've heard green mining a few times, which I thought was fascinating. So there's a lot of discursive shifts as well as new forms of mining regimes that, and this is maybe the little box there that's quite simplistic, but basically I'm interested in looking at how this new form of mining regime being promoted by the World Bank are changing the roles and responsibilities of the different actors involved in mining, notably government, civil society, and the private sector. So to look at a shift in those types of roles and responsibilities, and of course legitimacies. And that brings me to point C, which is basically fighting back. I'm also interested in looking at what form of contestation, what form of contestations are emerging on the ground. By the way, I know I have a French Canadian accent, and I tend to bow. And I'm English. Doing my best here, bear with me. The conceptual framework that I've been using, I've been flirting a lot with legal pluralism, which I thought was a very interesting tool to look at, because it focuses on the evolving regulatory framework within which mining activities take place. And here it allows you to insist on the changing roles played by the actors involved, but multilateral, national, local, public, private. But for instance, you cannot talk about new mining regimes and mining without talking, for example, discussing about the Canadian government, or in this case, the Australian government. You can talk about the World Bank, you have to talk about the ADB, you have to talk about the state, but also disaggregate the state from national, regional, local, and all these different layers where everything can go very, very wrong. And of course, lots of literature from critical political economy insights, most notably Bonnie Campbell, which have been working for more than 20 years on different generations of mining codes being promoted in Africa. So when I talk about the weight of the bank, so basically why talk about the World Bank when we're talking about something like the extractive industry? And here I'm not just talking about Asia, I'm talking about Africa as well, and to some instances in Latin America. The World Bank has really developed a niche in terms of its expertise in terms of mining. and this is a historical expertise. It's been at least the last 30 years that the World Bank has been doing technical assistance projects in terms of mining. And IBRD and EDA are mostly doing technical assistance, like if I'm simplifying things. So basically, new mining laws and reforms, so working with governments to change the laws, most notably to make them more enticing for private companies to come. Social environmental reforms, I briefly told you about this, but the World Bank has been championing very much a new form of mining regimes, which I said would really take into account civil society, participatory approaches, that would very much insist for very solid environmental safeguards, as well as, of course, tax reforms. You want to entice companies to come in the country, institutional reforms, often reforms of ministries of mine, etc., would be part of the technical assistance project of the bank, or at least it was the case for the 3 case studies that I've looked at. So that's World Bank and EDA. And then on the other hand, you have the 2 arms of the bank that are working with the private sector, so IFC coming to literally invest in a project with the companies. And then you have NIDA, which serves as an insurance organization. It insures the company for political risk. So they all work in a way that, on the one hand, we work with the public sector. Once we've done the reforms, there's also the IFC and NIGA that come in and really entice the companies to actually come, now that we have new mining regime that is quite enticing. And overall, it's the influence of the World Bank Group. As a group, it acts as a catalyst for investments in the sector. So if the bank is there, they will come. This is basically NIGA, for example, really advertised itself that when it's involved in the project, basically no government would dare to mess around with that project. So thus, it's very solid when the World Bank Group is involved. Actually, it does work in the sense that, especially for Africa, we had a huge mining boom after the second generation of mining codes by the end of the 1990s. In Asia, obviously, you also have a race for the resources. It's estimated that the World Bank has assisted more than 100 countries in reforming their mining laws and institutions over the past 20 years. So it's quite sizable. Like when I say that it's an expertise, it's really something that the World Bank has developed a niche. Okay. So this is very, very simplified, so bear with me. And I know that I'm in Perth, so I feel that I'm talking to mining specialists. I don't know if every single person in this room is a specialist, so maybe this is quite simple, but the logic goes that mining is one of the most investment risk sector that can be undertaken. So the risk for investors are very big. Thus, you need to compensate by increasing the incentives that you will be providing for the companies that will risk investing in your country. So it's highly capital intensive. There's all these uncertainties with the prices, as we know very well, technological uncertainties, the period, well, you know this, okay. And so the incentive is basically the recipe that the World Bank has come up with, and it did that in Africa, which was also quite interesting, but it does that in Asia at this very moment. It's basically to bring resource-rich countries to compete against one another for basically the most liberal mining code that they can come up with. So basically, it's bringing the Philippines to compete against Laos, and Laos to compete against another regional player. So it's very much a race, not to the bottom, but a race for the most liberalized type of mining regimes that can be. Of course, the problem, and now I'm just arriving to 2001. I'm doing a little bit of history here. When James D. Wolfenson became president of the bank, obviously he inherited a World Bank that was coming very much under fire, especially for the environmental impacts of some of their projects, notably mining or big dams, etc., the human rights impacts, the social impacts, etc. And of course, mining became one of the most obvious examples that could be taken. So a lot of international NGOs, local communities, the media, a lot of attention was put on this sector. And the Extractive Industry Review, the EIR, was created, which is by Wolfenson, which was basically to independently evaluate the role of the World Bank in mining, and basically whether or not the World Bank Group should remain involved in mining activities. So the question was, can the extractive industry be a vehicle for poverty alleviation through sustainable development? A big question. The EIR concluded pretty much with a maybe if the right conditions are there. So yes, the World Bank can remain involved, but it should prioritize poverty reduction. Also, it should insist on free, prior, informed consent, as well as not be involved at all in conflict zones. The World Bank's response to the EIR came in 2004, and basically there's a pretty quote here. Our future investment in extractive industry will be selective, with greater focus on the needs of poor people and on promoting environmentally and socially sustainable development. Basically what the World Bank said was, we will remain involved in the extractive industry, but like the EIR suggested, we will indeed insist on poverty reduction. So for now on, every project that we will have in the sector will be tailored for poverty reduction. And two other things, it did reject the idea of free, prior, and informed consent, and it also rejected the idea of not being present in conflict zones in terms of mining. So that was also left on the side. But the EIR very much provoked a reflection within the World Bank, kind of thinking that was quite sizable, and it really revamped itself. The World Bank really revamped itself. And when I say the World Bank, I'm talking also about the IFC and MIGA. They really changed their discourse. They really, at least discursively, changed their approach to mining activities. So there was a major shift in the involvement of the bank by 2005. And this is what I found very interesting to study. Basically, the book is about looking at this post-EIR era at the World Bank and what has actually happened after all this thinking at the beginning of 2000s. Basically, the logic of the World Bank to remain involved in mining is basically saying that if it's not involved, the standards will remain quite low. So because of its expertise and also its safeguards and standards that go beyond the ones of the industry, the mere presence of the World Bank Group in a project is, at least will help certify that there will be environmental safeguards, social safeguards. It will bring local community participation, etc. So this is basically what I call this type of new framework that really takes into account social aspect and environmental aspect that I call the social development model. And you can see the shift with this table, which is adapted from a table of the World Bank itself, where you see the new roles and responsibilities that are assigned to the different stakeholders, the government, private sectors, and NGOs and local communities. And you see that the private sectors and local communities are now really asked to play a much more important role, and notably the private sector in terms of social and environmental responsibilities, new types of partnerships, notably with civil society, Here we're talking obviously about corporate social responsibility, etc. And very much a big role to be played by NGOs and local communities. So basically this new model is on the one hand a discursive shift, but it's also a shift in practices on the ground. It carries an unwavering emphasis on poverty reduction, social and environmental safeguard, and it brings with it a certain legitimacy, both for the World Bank and the project. So also a company that will be investing alongside the IFC, you kind of have this legitimacy that comes attached to it, at least discursively and technically. But it's also a shift in practices, because when we look at the mining regimes and what they actually imply for the different actors in mining, you can see that basically by giving new roles and responsibilities, for example, to civil society, it really sets the type of participation, the type of debates, the types of discourse that will, for now on, be available to these types of communities. It also organizes the types of channels where you can actually communicate opposition or questions, etc. And in a way, and basically this is what the case studies are showing, it's a very technocratic, very depoliticized type of involvement of civil society, as well as the same thing for the companies. The argument in the book is that despite the social development model, there are some things that have remained deeply, deeply entrenched in the type of mining codes that are being advocated by the World Bank. So these are kind of the norms that do not change, that stay very much present despite more recent changes. So priority given to the private sector is quite obvious. It's the World Bank, so the public sector should not be involved in mining activities. Priority given to mining over other types of territorial use. For example, in the Philippines, the government is trying to become self-sufficient in terms of rice production, but it can be quite difficult when you also have so much land that are available for mining. Priority given to the exportable type of resources, notably gold. Priority given to the industrial sector. And that's quite important, especially when you look at, for example, Mongolia, Philippines. It's also the case where if you really want to talk about poverty reduction, you know, for these types of countries, artisanal mining is probably where the employment is going. It's where most of the revenues are. So it's very much something to take into account. However, the World Bank has been promoting mostly in the industrial sector, of course. Guarantees protecting mining rights, so the emphasis here are on the rights of the companies, and the benefits of mining, basically the contributions of mining, are very much focused on tax revenues. Okay, so maybe to make this a little bit more interesting, I'll talk to you about my findings for Mongolia. This is in the Gobi Desert, or at least it's the beginning of the Gobi, and you have these signs that are spread across the Gobi, which is an ad for Oishi being that is going to be the second or third, depending on sources, biggest gold and copper mine in the world that is being built dead in the middle of the Gobi Desert, and it's a venture with the government of Mongolia, 34% of ownership, and then it's mainly Rio Tinto as well as a few bits and pieces for the Canadians with turquoise hills. And Rio, basically here, the only thing I want you to remember is the influence that Rio Tinto has in Mongolia cannot be understated. Overstated? No, overstated. Still working on my English. There are advertisements everywhere. In Ulaanbaatar, it's one of the biggest buildings. In Yubi, there are advertisements on TV all the time. Oyu Tolgoi itself, without talking about the other big mines that are in the world, is supposed to very soon account for 30% of the entire economy, like full stop. So it's definitely quite impressive. It has mineral reserves that are valued at about $1.3 trillion. It has reserves, it's mostly coal, gold, and copper. However, we seem to be discovering new resources every day. The mining boom, which is extremely recent, and I guess that's why Mongolia is so fascinating, is that it's happening just now. It basically started 10 years ago, and now the mines, for the first time, are starting to really mass produce. Oyu Tolgoi started last year to produce. Tavantargoy will be the biggest coal mine on earth, and it's just 200 kilometers away from Oyu Tolgoi. So you can imagine these massive undertaking in the Gobi Desert. And Tavantargoy is active now, but there's the second phase and third phases that are supposed to start as well as for Oyu Tolgoi. So there are more massive developments that are supposed to start. So now everything is just beginning, but there's so much money pouring out of these mines. It's absolutely incredible, the impact that it has on the country. And all this is extremely recent, as I'm saying, it's within the last 10 years. And now we're seeing Oyu Tolgoi start its last year. So almost every citizen wants to work for the mine, wants to work for Oyu Tolgoi. And when I say almost every citizen, we have to also remember that Mongolia is only 3 million people. So it's a lot of riches, and there are a lot of political promises whereby, because of these numbers, $1.3 trillion, and that there's only 3 million citizens, that everybody will be a millionaire. So the political speeches are quite interesting. Anyway, all this to say that it made Mongolia the fastest growing economy in the world, at least last year, 17%. That's almost twice as much as China. I mean, these are quite important number, but it also tells us how much Mongolia is relying on the promises of the sector. I have a map for you guys if you're not too familiar with the Gobi. Oyu Tolgoi is located, as I said, dead in the middle of the Gobi, and Tavantargoy is right next door, and you will notice that below the big line is China. So obviously everything will simply be trucked straight to China. And apparently China has already given itself a discount on any products that comes from Mongolia. So apparently it would be 30% less than the normal market rate. So there are active negotiations at this very moment between the government and China. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the bank now. This Coca-Cola bottle, I really like it. It's overseeing the central square of Ulaanbaatar. I don't know if you've ever been to Ulaanbaatar, but it's like this massive ex-Soviet satellite. So it's really Soviet. And then you have right in front of it this symbol, this Coca-Cola symbol that basically tells it all. It's very revealing. As soon as the Russians left in 1989, it started a transition toward the market-oriented system, and the IMF and the World Bank were very much involved in this transition. And as soon as 1991, the World Bank started a technical assistance project for the extractive industry in Mongolia. Sadly, the Russians had decided to indeed geologically map Mongolia, but they left with the maps. They didn't leave them to the Mongolian government, so everything was to start with them. This table I find quite interesting because it really maps the presence of the World Bank in terms of basically anything that has to do with mining, especially for the public sector. The World Bank has been there with technical assistance projects. Those are the projects that are more than $1 million. And to the right-hand side, you can see the dates. So it's very much an active presence. The mining code was rewritten twice, and both times it was with a technical assistance project of the World Bank. The second time being now, and it's currently being debated in the Parliament. I should also say that Oyu Tolgoi, which is the copper gold one, is currently being considered for a $300 million loan by the IFC, as well as $1 billion MEGA guarantee against political risk. And also the World Bank was very much involved in writing the blueprints for the investment agreement with Oyu Tolgoi. I would basically argue that of all the case studies that I've looked at, Mongolia is probably the one that is the easiest to make the case that the World Bank pretty much had a very crucial influence over basically anything mining that is happening in the country. It's a clear presence. Okay, so what has actually happened? Look at my time because I've been talking a lot. Basically, when you look at the laws, the overall mining regime of Mongolia, it is indeed a mining regime that I call the third generation mining regime. It's a mining regime that is very much socially and environmentally aware. There are safeguards and provisions in the mining law, the 2006 mining law, that are indeed there. It's indeed quite impressive. There's a list that goes on, but basically it has provisions for local community, for participation. It has mine closure plans, etc. It has pretty much everything that you can wish when it comes down to protecting the environment in Mongolia. However, of course, the 2006 mining law says that if you're going to invest more than 50 million, then you don't necessarily have to. Then it's no longer the mining law that applies. Then it's an investment agreement, which would be quite common. But it also means that for Oyu Tolgoi, it's Rio Tinto that sat with the Mongolian government, and they basically just went at it to negotiate what would be the provisions for Oyu Tolgoi. As I said, that was sponsored by the World Bank, a World Bank Technical Assistance Project. And the blueprints for OTs are supposed to now be used for Tavantagor, which I was saying is going to be one of the biggest coal mines on Earth. The provisions that are given to Oyu Tolgoi, to Rio Tinto, are quite generous. For example, OT's tax rates are stabilized for 30 years. The fiscal provisions are actually quite generous. There was an agreement that if Rio Tinto was to invest in Oyu Tolgoi, that the government would have to abolish the windfall profits tax, etc. What's also interesting is that we said that for now on the World Bank would be involved in mining projects only in terms of its contribution to poverty reduction. And here, obviously, the statistics differ a little bit depending on who you're talking to, but NGOs are quite adamant that the levels of poverty are actually getting much higher since the mining boom. So basically, yes, there's a lot of money coming in the country, but it's money that is going very directly to certain pockets, and that the trickle-down effect is not very much present. The inflation rates are absolutely, what's the term? Thank you. Astronomical. Especially if you're in Ulaanbaatar, it's now very, very expensive to live in Ulaanbaatar. Like, people have very much difficulties securing an apartment, and you have now the Gur district, the Gur being these houses. You have the Gur district, a belt that is getting bigger and bigger all around Ulaanbaatar. People have to basically live there, and there's a migration from rural areas to the city because of increasing poverty rates. And by the way, like in winter, obviously Ulaanbaatar is really cold, and I'm from Quebec. So it's actually excruciatingly cold. So people in the Gur district don't have access to facilities, electricity, heating. So basically people burn anything and everything they can find in those little houses. Like, there's a little stove in the middle, and you visit people and suddenly they're like, you're a little bit cold, don't worry, and they take a piece of tire and a piece of plastic bottle and they put it in, and you're like, oh goody. And anyway, it makes Ulaanbaatar the most polluted city on earth in winter. And did I mention that it's only 3 million inhabitants within the entire country, so it's a lot of burning pretty much anything and everything that you can find. Okay, there's also one of the main problems with mining as well is obviously the corruption level that went, again, became astronomical. I have a quote from the Financial Times, which basically says the aspiration to turn Mongolia into Qatar is admirable. The likelihood of it becoming Nigeria, though, is not negligible. A country with fragile institutions and a GDP per capita of $3,000 is about to be host with billions of dollars. What could possibly go wrong? And I think that that's probably a quote that really wraps it up. When we look at what is happening in the Gobi, we see that when we look at the implementation process, I see you jumped ahead and actually read that brilliant quote. It's basically, yes, you have the law, but when it comes down to implementation, that's obviously where we see things going very much wrong. That's the case for the Philippines and Laos and many other countries as well. But the World Bank really frames it in terms of capacity. So it's going wrong, so we just need more capacity, more capacity building for the government, etc. But there are realities that are quite obvious. For example, it's in the middle of the Gobi Desert. Like, we're building two of the biggest projects on Earth dead in the middle of the desert. And it's Robert Friedland, who's Ivanovich's chief executive officer, which is now Turquoise Hill. So it's the Canadians that are in a joint venture with Rio Tinto. And he was caught saying this, that the nice things about the Gobi is that there's no one. And it's very much true. There's no one. They're just...
I think he was down there's no water courses either.
I'm so sorry?
There's no water courses. There's no water resources.
Yeah, that's my next slide. Water is indeed obviously quite an issue. But the beauty indeed of the Gobi is that you have nomadic populations. So even in terms of claiming the land, it's very much difficult for the herders that have been migrating. Thank you. Migrating for centuries to suddenly have all these grazing lands that are very much being impacted, not only in terms of the roads that are being built, but also because of the dust of all the trucks that are basically driving straight to China, as well as indeed the water issue that is quite important. I lied, it's the second after this, the water slide. This one is the impacts that are already being felt. Obviously, you have massive new types of populations that are coming and being settled in camps to work for Uturgoy. So it's bringing with it new types of challenges, environmental challenges, as well as many sex workers that are coming where the mining boys are. It challenges herders' livelihood as well, which is still about 30% of the population who's nomadic. It threatens wildlife. Obviously, it's a very, very fragile ecosystem in the Gobi. But Rio Tinto is saying that there's absolutely no problem because they have a new form of technology, and this is very much embedded in the investment agreement that was, as I said, the blueprints were written in partnership with the bank. So in terms of water, the mining boom is then in the middle of the desert. Mining requires large quantities of water, by the way. So OT alone will need to use 920 liters of water per second for the next 30 years. And then the mine can continue for another 30 years. So this is completely denied by OT, but many of the herders that I had conversations with around the mine, not many, all of them, I haven't met one herder that didn't tell me that the water levels, as well as the speed, how do I say that, the current?
Artesian water.
Yes, it's artificial. Oh, I should have my keyboard there. Believe it or not, they let me teach in English. So it's the depth of the water that has changed, as well as it's not flowing as fast as it used to. Flowing, that's what I was looking for. And the OT is supposed to go get the water even deeper than the I'm really not doing well. You get it, right? It's changing, it's taking a lot of water. OT is saying there's no problem, but already within 1 year, herders are seeing changes that are quite important. It's anecdotal, obviously, but they show me different wells, and you can see the lines that are going lower and lower. So it's definitely an issue. I have a picture here. Like, you have these wells across the Gobi, and you can see there's nothing anywhere, and then suddenly there's like a million goats just throwing themselves at, and then there's a camel right behind it, and so the herders just share all these different wells that happened there historically. So if anything happens with the mine, if there was an environmental catastrophe, which apparently it's impossible in mining, you would have the only source of water in the entire Gobi that could basically get polluted at the exact same time. Another problem, which I think is quite interesting, is the cumulative impacts of mining. Because I just talked to you about Oyu Tolgoi alone, but Tabantalgoi that's the coal mine, is 160 kilometers away from Uti. Tsagan Suhaga, which is another big one, is 230 kilometers away, and there are 6 other average-sized mines in the 500-kilometer radius, and of course we have China that's 240 kilometers away. So that's really quite a lot of mining activities that are about to, that have already started and that are going to increase in terms of that very small region of the Gobi and extremely fragile. By the way, most of the land on the border with China is considered natural reserve, so it's legal to do mining in that region. But I love this. China built the road on the other side, so then it's like fait accompli, the road is there, so you kind of have no choice, and they started building the road actually. No, not that. I'm trying to get out of it. Oh, foreign private sector investment, novel social environmental safeguards have now come to legitimize a continued and expanded involvement of the group in the mining sector. However, the SDN continues to exhibit serious repercussions for constituents in the global south, bringing into question the legitimacy of the model itself, its democratic ramifications, and ultimately the very role of the World Bank Group in the sector. I have a quote here that is from an NGO worker. An NGO, it's basically a one-woman NGO that has been very much interested in looking at what is happening with Oyu Tolgoi, and she works with the herder communities in the Gobi. And she says, we believe that the World Bank's leadership pushed too hard for the government to sign the unfair OT investment agreement. And this is also an issue that civil society raises in Mongolia. The former World Bank resident representative, for example, has been the largest supporter of this OT investment agreement and has made many public statements about this agreement being the model mining investment agreement for Mongolia, so that it would be the model as well for Mongolia. He has since moved directly from his position to heading Peabody Energy in Mongolia. Another former World Bank mining advisor is now the head of the Erdines Mongol mining companies. So basically, pro-mining policies will definitely benefit from the companies being run by these former World Bank officials. So basically, this is to say that there's also a lot of politics and basically all the politics of mining that is coming into play as well when we're looking at the weight of the World Bank in the sector. And I mean, that's true for the Philippines as well. So a few conclusions. All case studies that I've looked at demonstrate that the World Bank has been quite important in technical assistance projects for promoting a very peculiar type of mining norms in the country clients, notably large-scale foreign-led, and that there has been quite a success. I'm not just saying that the success in the mining boom is because of the World Bank, but I'm saying that it definitely allowed for the foundations of the legal regime to be there. However, as we can see, there are very important gaps between the social environmental provisions that have been attached to the very presence of the bank in the sector and the implementation process. And as I said, when we talk about World Bank official in Vientiane, in Ulaanbaatar, they all say it's just a question of capacity. We just need more capacity. And I feel that there's a certain, hypocrisy in saying it's just a question of capacity while you have been pushing for such mining projects so quickly, knowing very well from the beginning that there was basically no capacity. And that's very true for Laos. Laos has just exploded in terms of mining activity, and then everybody's just like, in Laos there's no capacity for very much area. Oh wow, I have many slides. Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's fine. Okay, let's just finish on that. Basically, the last chapter of the book is very much about how people are reacting are responding to the type of neoliberal norms that have been promoted with the third generation mining regimes, mostly under the leadership of the World Bank. And what we're seeing is that there's starting to be very much contestations that are happening to say that basically we need to rethink this. This is not the type of mining that we want. And in Mongolia, it's very, very fascinating to look at what is happening at this very moment, where there's a new government, and the coalition that has been in power has been wanting to renegotiate with Rio Tinto, and they want to scrap the investment agreement. Rio Tinto responded by saying fine, and they shut down Oyu Tolgoi. They fired everyone. And foreign direct investment plunged by 50%, depending on the most sensationalistic statistics. So the government is now really in total panic. So for the last month, there has been new waves of negotiation. So what the government had proposed as a new mining regime to replace the mining code that was adopted is now being basically scrapped, and I think we're going to see the neoliberal norms very much reappear in the new version. So I'm talking too much, I'm going to let it at this, and maybe we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascale. So I'll open it for questions. Shahar?
Yeah, thanks, Pascale. I'm going to ask a bit of a devil's advocate question, I guess. First of all, I think that most people would recognise that the big expansion in mining over the last 10 years has had a lot to do with the sharp rise in demand and prices and so on, which made companies a bit more willing to take risks. The World Bank, I think, played a role in facilitating, but it didn't create that demand in the first place. But the question I was going to ask, given that that's the situation, isn't it better that the World Bank is involved? Because everyone that used to bang on about how bad the World Bank is now talks about how bad China is, right? And suddenly there's a kind of nostalgia to the World Bank, at least in some circles. So isn't it better, even with all the stuff that you showed, considering that these projects will probably take place because companies are willing to invest, at least for a while now, maybe less so because prices have come down a bit. Is it better?
Taken one more question as well.
Okay.
Jeff?
Yeah, I guess it comes down to this last slide that you've left up here. This is really nice to see because I actually know a bit about mining policy on Mongolia and no one else I've ever met does. So it's a conversation, or except for people that work for Rio Tinto, and you can imagine what they say about it. But if for example, we were Rio Tinto or an international mining company, particularly in some of the smaller coal projects, I think they would probably strongly disagree with your characterisation that Mongolia provides a pro-business, free market, friendly place for investment in mining. It's certainly the case that the mining code in 2006 did have the World Bank's fingerprints on it and was like that. But as you said, it was only projects under 50 million, which is basically artisanal mining. Anything industrial scale has got $1 billion at the least on the price tag. So it was kind of a law that didn't really apply to the projects that are contributing 30% of the country's GDP. And the story Baden told was really Rio Tinto, and each servant tells the stories. It's been ripped off by these populist Mongolians doing pork barrelling. It had to give a 34% stake to the Mongolian government, which the only other place it's done that's in Guinea, over Semendu. And it doesn't do that anywhere else in the world. The windfall profits tax was repealed, but then there was export taxes applied after the fact. There was also mining royalties were increased. And for this reason, Mongolia and a couple of other countries, including Guinea, are put at the very bottom of political risk surveys by the global industry. In fact, if you ask people from Rio Tinto, they'd say, if it wasn't for the fact that it's the single biggest copper reserve in the world, we wouldn't be anywhere near these guys because they're terrible, and we'd rather operate in some places in sub-Saharan Africa because we get better conditions there. So from the industry's point of view, and this is what's led to these breakdowns in negotiation over the last couple of years, since really 2009 after Rio took over, I think. So from an industry point of view, they would list all of that stuff and say this is actually one of the most business hostile places to be working in the world, not one of the most business friendly, and that the mining code that's on the laws just doesn't get applied to us. That we don't actually get the mining code that the World Bank wrote. We get an investment agreement where every 6 months we turn back up to Mongolia to say we want more. Sorry. Okay. So I guess what I'd like you to do is imagine I was Rio Tinto and just said that. How would you respond?
Thank you. There are those two questions.
Thank you. Shahar, should the World Bank be involved in mining? Because if they're not, it's going to be worse. Well, it's basically the main central core argument of the bank. If we're not there, Chinese are going to come, they're going to do it. My response to this would be, but it's basically not my place to say, but what the cases of Mongolia, Laos, and the Philippines have clearly shown is that even the standards of the bank, so the standards that are supposed to be above the industry, are actually not being respected. So the bank is not respecting its own standards. Right now there's in Mongolia, there's a petition for the ombudsman of the World Bank to basically say that the World Bank hasn't respected its own standards. So I think that that in itself is something that should be thought about, that if indeed the World Bank is going to remain involved, which it said in 2004, and that the reason was because it's bringing standards above the industry, well, it should at least respect its own standards. And so far, my research tells me that it has not been happening. So maybe that's something that should be taken into account. And the second thing is, it's public institution. I'm not quite sure that in the name of poverty reduction, investing in, for example, a Utorgoy is what it is that we should be doing in the name of development. But again, that's just my opinion. But it is indeed what you're bringing to the table is indeed something to definitely be discussed. And in Mongolia, yes, the Chinese. In Laos, yes, the Chinese. So it's also a very interesting player that is, yeah, everybody says, if not the bank, China. So that would be my answer. Jeff, I appreciate it. I have never actually met somebody at a conference that actually could quote the 2006 mining code.
I have a number of rare skills, and this knowing that we'll know in mining code as
Go
well.
for coffee. Yes.
Been waiting.
Sorry.
So I am impressed. Yes, I've actually skipped a couple of pages. I invite you to read my chapter. I would like to have your comments. But I am when I'm talking about Mongolia, I am indeed basically discussing all the changes in laws that have made that really did make Mongolia indeed one of the not so friendly mining partners in the region. But my focus has very much been on the bank. So I think that it's multi-layered, and I think that it's still very easy or interesting to look at the World Bank that keeps on attempting to push for a very specific type of mining regime. And at the end of the day, although now it's trying to be renegotiated, the investment agreement with Rio Tinto, yes, it's 34% that went to the government, and yes, it's indeed sizable, but it's still, I think that it's still quite generous, and I think that Rio Tinto is calling the bluff of the government at this very moment, and it's going to win in a way that any type of, not any type, but many of the types of attempts by respective governments since 2006 to challenge the neoliberal norms that I have listed at the very beginning. You'll have very much political stance, but at the end of the day, like the windfall profit taxes has been removed. Now there was the new investment law that they were threatening to pass that was supposed to be asking that from now on there would be, for example, mandatory 50% ventures with Mongolian capital and with foreign corporations. That was discussed for months, and it was arguably seen as very terrible, but it never happened. So in terms of what's actually being said and threatened and what is actually happening in Mongolia, I think that it's a little bit maybe overstated, if that makes sense. But I would love to grab coffee and hash away on the 2006 mining law.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help thinking that, you know, the World Bank is probably finding itself in a situation that it can't control that it's becoming an increasingly irrelevant player compared to, say, 15 or 20 years ago when it was very important in rewriting all these investment laws, introducing market reforms. And then, of course, when it's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, you know, letting the Sorcerer's Apprentice go, and then it's all out of control. And so then they become interested in things like good governance and poverty reduction and all that sort of. Now, and that's where it seems to me that they become increasingly irrelevant. And I would have known. Did you have a look at some of their, you know, attempts at, say, you listed them up there, environmental control, you know, poverty reduction, governance, all that sort of thing, trying to sort of contain the natural products of huge mining investment in a country. I mean, I don't know, but it would seem to me that their attempts to do this would be fairly unsuccessful. Did you have I don't know, in the book, have you got a chapter on the World Bank and, you know, its attempts to mitigate the effects of mining?
Well, basically the book is about that, where basically where I think that the weight of the bank is, and there is also the case that it's becoming indeed more and more irrelevant. But I think that it's as presenting itself as an expert in terms of, for example, social and environmental safeguards. It's really the bank that is writing the book in terms of, for example, IFC policies, safeguard policies that are very much quoted, that are shown as standards. But indeed, when you turn around and you look at what is happening on the ground, the World Bank is indeed, like in Laos, I had fascinating conversations with World Bank officers where they're really banging their heads on the tables because it really worked. Like, you have a mining boom that has just exploded, and now the World Bank is writing reports that is saying the government needs to slow down, and indeed it's big reports that are all about the environment, and the government needs to protect the environment, etc. But it's, I don't know if that is.
It's out of control.
It definitely is, especially in Laos. In Laos, it's quite incredible.
Diane?
Yeah, but I think it comes back to your framework where you were talking about discursive shifts and shifts in practice, and where the bank has strength is in discursive shifts, because at the end of the day it's a tiny organisation, it's only 12,000 employees, there's only so much it can do. And the other word that kept coming up on your slides was partnership. It's very dependent on the alliances and partnerships that it forges either with client countries or donor countries to execute the policy. So while it can institute discursive shifts, it's very, very reliant on other actors to actually implement them. And market actors move so much faster than de jure actors, if you like, in terms which are always reactive, in a sense, to the negative or perverse outcomes of the boom or whatever it is. So that's a comment. I'm trying to think of putting it into a question, which would be, who are the World Bank's partners in actually trying to get outcomes for social development and poverty alleviation in civil society or other international actors? The trust funds, I saw that mentioned at one point. Who helps in actually generating the kinds of outcomes?
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because, I mean, in terms of the politics and that government, civil society, corporations, you'd think civil society might see that discursive shift and see that as a target for their demands. So, demand that you actually implement that against the corporations. So, there's more of that.
I agree, and this is what, and indeed it goes back to framework. I was interested in looking at the bank at 3 levels, like 3 different levels. One that we could also call the discursive shifts, which is very much how the World Bank is sitting down. And I know how general it is to say the World Bank, but how it's sitting down and conceptualizing mining regimes. And for that, I've basically mapped 3 different types of mining regimes in time. And the type of mining regimes, for example, in Laos being the very 3rd generation. So how they're conceptualizing it. And then the second layer is how it's being implemented. And by here we're talking indeed, the words would be partnerships, but how basically it actually is being integrated in the law, those types of reforms, those types of institutions that are being adopted, as well as, for example, the private sector embracing these types of norms that are being attached to the technical assistance projects and everything. And of course, this is a beast on its own, and it's very quite different from one country to the other, as well as from one period of time to the other, and that's very much true for Mongolia, where basically it changes every month, where it's very, very difficult to map. And also, I want to write a paper about electoral cycles and these types of things, where suddenly if you're going to have an election, it becomes quite interesting to see how there's a shift in, there's much more opposition to these types of neoliberal norms in a way that's much more populistic. The discursive shift, I think, is quite important and can indeed be used as a tool by civil society organizations, for example, bringing attention to environmental damage or the need for participation, informed consent, etc. But the argument that I'm making in the book is that the way that civil society is very much invited to participate, and this is the case for Philippines as well as Mongolia. Laos, to say civil society, like seriously, I've looked for it for quite a long time, but it's all over the World Bank reports, civil society. But when you go to Laos, it's basically non-existent, and that also highlights one of the issue, is that there's certainly a form of instrumentalization of civil society that once it has participated or been participated, it brings an aura of legitimacy to the project. There are, maybe I'm explaining it badly, but in the book I'm really trying to bring attention to this very much where the discursive shift that brings attention to participation to civil society has really taken a turn that I find it is quite
What about partnership?
quite important. I'll just give the example of participation in the Gobi has because if the IFC is going to finance Oyu-Tolgoi, it has to, these IFC safeguards are kicking in, and it's really interesting to follow how they're being implemented. And that's very much the IFC, it's not the government, it's the one, it's really the IFC that's very much there. And the participation process, how it has happened, is basically company representative going from one GER to the other, which are separated in hundreds of kilometers, and basically herders has been signing a little piece of paper on the bottom corner, and herders have had a lot of difficulties to talk to one another, to really communicate with one another because of distance, and obviously it's Mongolia is the least densely populated region after Greenland, so to actually get the momentum going, it's quite difficult. But definitely the participatory process, I would venture, has definitely been quite flawed in practice in the Gobi, and yet when you look at the documents, it's almost certified that the herders have been very much involved, that there's been consent, etc. And I think that's very much not the case. Partnerships. In terms of partnerships, I was more talking about, for example, corporate social responsibilities, types of partnerships where NGOs are asked to participate in some of the projects, etc. I don't know if that answers your question.
Jim?
I was wondering if you could perhaps just comment briefly on the Philippine case in relation to your two other cases. It seems to me that in relation to some of the questions that have been raised, the prior history of both Laos and Mongolia being affected by, for want of a better term, socialist states, and then the character of effective participation in, let's say, a post-socialist era, as opposed to the Philippines. It's in terms of the temporal dimension, in Laos and in Mongolia, the way you're describing it, it sounds like it's an emergent resource frontier. I mean, there are elements of what you're talking about that remind me of the Trans-Mississippi West in the second half of the 19th century in terms of what's playing out on a steppe, a semi-arid steppe, as opposed to the North American plain in the second half of the 19th century, but involving nomadic people again. And in the case of the Philippines, though, there is a long history of mining, and there's a history of a different form of government that's imposed in the post-colonial era, and there's a history of a World Bank presence there that's been written about and critiqued. And I'm wondering, what is it about your Philippine case in your conclusions, both with respect to the World Bank and how it's playing out in the Philippines as opposed to Laos and Mongolia, that is in any way strikingly different? And if so, why?
Thank you for that question. I'm very happy to talk about the Philippines. I think that one of the facets of the book is that indeed I wanted very drastic different types of case studies, but they all have in common mining and they all have in common the bank, which was my focus. But in the Philippines, indeed, it's dramatically contrasts with Mongolia and Laos, because indeed Philippines has a very, very rich history of mining activities. So in that sense, it was a very different case study. However, the World Bank has been quite active in the Philippines historically in also helping with the mining law. The 1995 mining code had very much involved the World Bank, and much more recently many other technical assistance projects. But when I visited the office of the IFC in Manila, the first thing that the director of the office told me is that the World Bank does not do mining. We don't do mining in the Philippines. Like, we don't do it. Which is not true, like they have projects in mining, but it's so political in the Philippines that you can see that indeed in recent years the World Bank has indeed taken a very much back presence, because it's far, far too explosive. However, having said that, the 5 minutes later, the IFC officer was telling me how the IFC was very much seeking to find the right project, the right mining project in the Philippines to invest. I don't remember how many millions of dollars it was, but they basically were looking all across the country they were desperate basically to invest in the Philippines, but they just wanted to find the right project. So there is a presence there, but indeed mining has been extremely political, especially these days. So it's also very much interesting to find, to discuss this third objective, basically, of the book, which is how people have been fighting back. And there is a rich debate that has been happening for many years in the Philippines, and how the church, the courts, the different civil society coalitions have been very much opposing mining activities. And it's also interesting, of course, with this new government to see what is happening. And very much halted all types of activities that were in the works with this new program.
Okay, I'm afraid time is getting away from us, so I do need to close the session. But just to say thank you very much, Pascale. I hope we'll read your book, and I hope you come back and see us again sometime.
Thank you so much.